on the issue of childhood cancer is Congressman Dan Hall from Maryland.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, and I want to thank Congressman McCaul, Congressman Joe Sestak for their leadership of the Pediatric Caucus. Mike has been a great champion, and both Joe and Mike obviously bring the personal experiences to bear on this issue. And I just want to salute them for all they've done. This has been an important fight, one of the most important fights I think we have in the United States of America, to make sure that we find a cure for childhood cancer. So Mike, thank you for your leadership. If we could congratulate Congressman McCaul on his leadership. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. It's wonderful to be here with Deborah Price. And Deborah Price, as you know, has been sort of the mother of this movement in the United States Congress. And she, of course, brings to this issue the terrible tragedy she experienced with her daughter, Caroline. But she's somebody who decided at that point in time to make sure that she would do everything possible to try and prevent other families from experiencing that kind of pain. And to that, all of us are very grateful, and I was really pleased just to be able to be part of the team that worked with Deborah in passing the Conquering Childhood Cancer legislation a few years ago, and was very proud to be at the White House with her when President Bush signed that law. So, Deborah, thank you for your perseverance, thank you for your commitment, and we all owe Deborah Price a huge thank you. Jim Moran from Virginia has joined us, and I want to thank him. He's a member of the Appropriations Committee. And Deborah, Mike, and I know very well that we count on the appropriators to follow through on the authorization that we all passed as part of the Conquering Childhood Cancer Act. And so, Jim, thank you for your leadership. But I think you can see that this is obviously an issue that it's a nonpartisan issue. Bipartisan issue, nonpartisan issue, brings people together. I have to commend President Bush for signing the law that we passed in this Congress. And now we just need to accelerate the work, because one thing we know is that research on childhood cancer does bear fruit and success. We've seen dramatic changes in the number of children who survive childhood cancer, and that's a direct consequence of the work of the people in this room and your peers around the country. And so when you know something works, you keep on going, because we also know, despite the dramatic improvements we've made, it remains the #1 cause of death among young children. And so if you know you've got something that works, but you still haven't finished the job, it's the time to put your foot on the accelerator to get the job done, and that's what this is all about. So I salute all of you. I look forward to continuing to work with Mike, Joe Sestak, Deborah Price, and Jim Moran, and all of you on behalf of our children and families until we finish this job. Thank you so much for all you do.
Next, I think we're introducing, where's Laura? You're supposed to be up here right now.
I go down. Welcome. I'm Laura Benson. I'm with Congressman McCaul, and I just want to thank everyone for being here today, first of all.
I'm Adam Axler. I work with Representative Joe Sestak, who's joined us a little bit. We're both really excited to have this event today, and thank everybody for coming. I want to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. William Evans. Dr. Evans is the Director and CEO of the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. As a lot of you guys know, St. Jude's has been working with Washington University to set up the Pediatric Cancer Genome Project. It's doing a lot of cutting-edge research and is going to lead to some of the cures that and treatments that you guys are going to hear about today, and you know, about how we can try and get those out in the market and get them out to kids. So, with no further ado, Dr. Evans.
my pleasure and my privilege, really, to make a few short opening remarks for today's panel. I first want to thank Congressman McCaul and Congressman Sestak for being co-chairs of the caucus and for convening this panel today of experts in the field. All of us who share the passion for understanding what causes childhood cancer and how better to treat it. We've been part of a lot of success over the last 40 years. When I say we, I'm talking about the entire community of investigators, scientists, physicians, others taking care of children, and pushing cure rates from under 4% in 1960 to over 90% today for the most common form of childhood cancer. And overall, our efforts have pushed the cure rates to about 75% for all childhood cancers. That is remarkable progress. Yet, as you just heard, cancer remains a leading cause of death by disease in U.S. children. So it is a compelling problem that needs our best efforts to push those cure rates higher. Now, we know that cancer is a disease of our DNA, of our genome. Mutations occur in genes by chance or for whatever reason that cause a white blood cell to become a leukemia cell, that cause a brain cell to become a brain tumor. We know what some of those mutations are today, but we don't know all of them. Our data suggests that we know far from all of what those lesions are. We also know from today's studies that just as children develop different types of cancers than adults, adults develop breast cancer, lung cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, children don't develop those cancers. Children develop cancers of muscle, of bone, different types of leukemias, different types of breast cancers. We have now entered the era of targeted drug therapy. There's enormous effort in the private sector as well as within academia to find those mutations, which represents the targets for new drugs, and develop new drugs that specifically target what's wrong in the cancer cell and eliminate that without causing toxicity to the normal cell. And we'll hear later from the panel about the importance of not only curing more children with cancer, but preserving their quality of life among childhood cancer survivors. Well, in this era of targeted drug therapy, we know that those new drugs developed for adult cancers are likely not to work for children, because, as I just told you, the genetic damage that causes breast cancer is different than what causes childhood cancer. As the 2005 IOM report pointed out to all of us, there's not a strong financial incentive for the private sector to develop new drugs for childhood cancers because the market is much smaller. And so that report from the IOM said, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to bring government, academia, the private sector together to make sure that children benefit fully from this new science, from the strategies of finding targeted drugs for childhood cancer? The St. Jude, Washington University Pediatric Cancer Genome Project, which was launched in January of this year, is a $60 million 3-year effort to sequence fully the genome, all 3 billion bases of DNA, in the cancer cells of 600 different childhood cancers, and compare that to the DNA in the normal cells of those children. And by making those comparisons, that will lead us to what are those genetic abnormalities that are causing childhood cancer, and those will represent the targets that we'll be able to feed into new programs like our chemical biology and therapeutics program that will be screening drugs against those targets. This is what's happening in the private sector for adult cancers. We're here this morning to take action to ensure that children with cancer benefit fully from this effort over the next decade. St. Jude is committed and will put all of the data we generate from our genome project in the public domain. It will be accessible to doctors and scientists around the globe. We want it to become a platform on which discoveries are made that will lead to targeted new therapies that are more effective for childhood cancer. We certainly need leadership to make sure this happens, and we've got that. Look at who's in the room today. Look at the level of commitment from our government leaders, our academic leaders. What we are missing, of course, is the resources that can pull all of this together and push it forward faster. We're fortunate with the Conquer Childhood Cancer Act of 2008, and more recently the Creating Hope Act of 2010. Those are steps in the right direction. Now it's about how do we get the resources behind that legislation and bring the community together to ensure that children benefit from new cures. I think this is the most exciting time in my 30-plus years in science and medicine. The opportunities for discovery are unparalleled today, and I think this conversation this morning is about how do we make sure we take full benefit of that on behalf of children. And I thank you for a chance to give the opening remarks this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, and thank you. My thanks to St. Jude's for their leadership in this issue. You've done some incredible work, and we'll hear more about the genome project that I think will provide tremendous hope to many parents whose children have cancer. I want to first thank the co-host, John Lair with CureSearch. Thank you for co-hosting this. And I'm wearing a CureSearch tie this morning, just for the record. And Susan Weiner with the Children's Cause for Cancer Advocacy. Thank you so much for co-hosting this event. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, one of my best friends, he showed up to school and his hair started to fall out. And you know, when you're that young, you don't really understand what that really means. And then they said, well, he has something called leukemia. And at that age, it's hard to comprehend what that really means. And I'm sure to every child that comes down with cancer, it's hard to comprehend what they're going through themselves. His name was top 10 holder. His hair fell out completely. And then within a couple of months, we were at his funeral. And it really had a profound impact on me at a very early age. My father died from cancer. And then after I got elected to Congress, some constituents of mine came up to me, Tim and Donna Calder, who were sitting in the 2nd row, and they told me the story about their son, Adam, who died from cancer. And they wanted me to do something about it. And I thought, you know, now I'm in a role and I'm in a position where I may be able to make a difference. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day. Adam's Angels was formed. I started getting involved in the issue. Turned to our leader and champion, Deborah Price, who for so many years championed this cause, pushed her bill for so many years, persistently, and that legislation finally passed. It was named after her daughter. And I think it was one of the most bipartisan, nonpartisan displays in the House floor that I've ever experienced or participated in. And it was very moving in a very partisanly charged environment to have both sides of the aisle coming together on an issue that shouldn't be partisan. And it's all about saving children's lives. And the other thing I found was that, just amazingly, that childhood cancer was not an area invested in. That was largely ignored. The adult cancers were really where the focus lied, rather than saving children's lives. We have many more years to invest down the road. And I thought that was wrong. And I think, again, Deborah, thank you for your leadership in getting that legislation passed. I just want to thank you. What we're going to hear today, I don't think, again, as I said at the beginning, I don't think we've had so many experts on childhood cancer in one room before members of Congress ever. So this is very groundbreaking. Congressman Sestak will be here probably in about 30 minutes or so to join me. I want to thank him for his leadership. We founded and co-chaired the Pediatric Oncology Caucus. And it's designed to do one thing: raise awareness, create a legislative agenda, and get it passed, and invest in finding a cure for the #1 killer of children, and that's childhood cancer. And so with that, I just want to again thank all of you. Thank all of you for you showed up at the reception last night, and thank you for your personal testimony. Book Carry Me, if you haven't read it, is about a personal journal of a child who went through a very tough time, but with a lot of bravery. And so with that, I'll turn over the mic to, I guess we could say the chairman, the ranking member, how we're doing this here, but Jim Rand, who from Virginia, who has personally experienced childhood cancer from personal cause. And thank you so much, Jim, for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for co-chairing the caucus, and of course it's terrific to see Deborah and to think of her leadership and really make a difference. 16 years ago, my daughter was diagnosed with the flu. She kept getting worse, projectile vomiting and so on, and we kept bringing her back to the hospital. 5, 6, finally the 7th time, brought her back. I tried to wash her hair and couldn't touch the top of her head, and without her screaming in pain. And my wife and I insisted we're not going to leave the hospital until something is done. Some of you are nodding, having had that experience. I was playing in the playroom, and her mother was coming in to relieve me. It was fairly late at night, and she heard the two pediatricians, our two pediatricians, arguing. There were 2 points that one of them was making. One, that children don't get cancer. And secondly, that they would be paying a price for years to come if they ordered additional tests that had to be paid for by the HMO. Now, they were using different words, but that's basically the 2 arguments that were being given. They didn't want to take the risk because of the cost to their practice, and the likelihood was so remote that it could be cancer. So at that, I called a friend. I had fortunately served as staff on what was then the Labor HEW Corporation Subcommittee over on the Senate side, and so I knew a few people at NIH, and a doctor came over right away and examined her and asked the doctors if they had done MRI, CAT scan, anything to look at her head. And they said, we've concluded that this is the flu. So she said, we will pay for it, but we're going to do it at the hospital here. They did it about 2 a.m. in the morning. The pediatrician who had not been making that argument came into the room. I had been back relieving her mom, and he was pale and facey, clearly troubled, and he said, we've ordered a helicopter to move Dorothy from the hospital to Children's. And I said, why? And he said, well, we can't operate. And I said, but what are you operating on? And he said that your daughter has a massive malignant brain tumor. It's growing rapidly. We feel it needs to be operated on tonight. We call the doctor will come in and operate. And we drove over, they helicoptered her. And she, after the operation, she was strapped down, tried to move. You could see her struggling. Nothing we could do, and then she went into a coma for weeks. Some of you can maybe able to relate. I remember going to a costume store, buying a Barney outfit that shows how 16 years ago Barney was a big deal. She loved Barney. I walked down the hall of Children's with this big, massive head that's going like this, and I could hardly walk. All the kids got excited. When the room, no responsiveness. Went for weeks. She was in the coma. They had to take out a great deal of her brain, but through a combination of the only thing we can do now, really, until this until these strides that are being made by St. Jude's and other hospitals and the wonderful medical research community that this country is blessed with. But it's still cutting, poisoning, and burning. That's what we do in cancer. And so, but while she was given a prognosis of a 10% chance of survival, she's still with us. The real difficulty, of course, is discussing this with Dr. Burton. She's in a senior high school, and she's actually gotten a job at Ross. She counts the items that go into the dressing room, and she's very proud of herself. Takes the bus there, takes it back. Wonderful. But that's why I can relate a bit. I try not to just bring it out too much, obviously, because I still can't even discuss it very well publicly. But I know that each one of you have similar stories. The specifics are different, but the reality is the same. The fact that, as Mike says, and as you, Doctor, have underscored, and of course has motivated Deborah, that other than accidents, cancer is a principal killer of young children. My own feelings are that much of this is environmental. We've talked with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I fortunately have EPA and some of these agencies under the subcommittee that I now chair. And we're looking into endocrine disruptors in a major way and other things that could contribute. But the fact is, we know very little. We need to know more. And until we do, other wonderful, healthy lives so full of potential are going to be arrested and terminated. And that's what this is about. That's why this is so important that all of you be here and that the Caucus be responsive. So I do appreciate you. I know that each one of you have made individual efforts and collectively we are going to change this and create a much brighter potential for the I was supposed to use a speech so I wouldn't break down, so I've got all kinds of wonderful statistics. So I'll use one of them. 12,500 children will be diagnosed with this year at a minimum with pediatric cancer. This is the maybe be low, but we're going to do everything we can to extend those lives and hopefully present the onset of cancer. So thank you all very much for your attention.
I know it's difficult to recount that experience, and thank you for sharing that with us. And, the children don't have a voice, and the only people that can lend a voice are the parents who've gone through this experience, the professionals who practice in this area, and now you have members of Congress who want to be advocates for you as well. And I think that statistic, Jim, is incredible. If we knew someone who was something that was killing 12,500 children a year, wouldn't we want to invest everything we have to stop that killer? And, with that, I want to turn the microphone over to another great champion, Deborah Price, who's also had a similar experience.
Well, thank you all for this opportunity. opportunity. I don't want to take a lot of time because you're not here to hear me. You're here to hear what wonderful things are happening in the scientific community. But I just want to say, when I lost my Caroline 11 years ago, we held the first ever hearing on Capitol Hill in the year 2000. And we had it in Canton Caucus, and we heard the stories and the testimonies of families, children who had survived, children who knew they were living with a death sentence. It was the most heart-rending day of my entire life, except the day that I lost my daughter. Those experiences can translate into action. And my message to you is to keep telling those stories. They have to be heard, as painful as they are for us to share. And Jim, things that you said just brought back clear memories. Playroom. You know, we've all been in the playroom. The happy times were in the playroom. The relationships were built in the playroom. The misdiagnosis, how many of us have been there? You know, it's growing pains, it's shin splints, it's the flu. You know, we all share so much in common. We have to tell those stories, and it's great to have. Today we had not only our wonderful host and chairman this morning, Mike McCaul, and Joe Sestak will be here later, but we had Jim Moran, Keith Schuler, is Keith still here? He was here, Walter Jones, Howard Coble, Marcia Blackburn. We have had great interest from the Congress, not just staff members, many of them are here, but members of Congress actually spending their time on this issue. That's a wonderful advance. Standing room only crowd here, it's terrific. Thank you to Susan Weiner, the Children's Cause, and John Lear of Cure Search for hosting our breakfast. But let's get on with the show. It's an important day. Let's do this every year. It's incredible that we have this kind of presence right here in the nation's capital. Nothing will happen without you keeping the pressure on. So thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the first panel. And I think it's fitting that this occurs in the Science and Technology Committee hearing room, because science and technology will find the cure for this cancer. Our panel includes Dr. Peter Adamson. If you want to come forward. And Peter Adamson currently serves both as a professor of pediatrics and pharmacology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the chair-elect of Children's Oncology Group. Following him will be Dr. Susan Blaney, the Deputy Director of Texas Children's Cancer Center. And to sum up the panel is Dr. Jeannie Kleinerman, who serves as a professor and head of the Division of Pediatrics at MD Anderson Cancer Center. All three of these panelists are internationally recognized for their work in this field and have a wealth of experience and knowledge in developing better treatments for kids and improving access. And just on a personal note, to Dr. Kleinerman, my wife is on the board at MD Anderson and chairs the Childhood Cancer Committee, and it's been a real joy to work with her and with my wife as a team on this issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panel for opening statements.
Thank you, Congressman McCaul, and thank both you and Representative Sestak and all your colleagues on the Congressional Pediatric Cancer Caucus for the work you do. So I'm going to depart from the text. There's a prepared statement, but I'll depart. Much of my work over the last 25 years has been in trying to develop new experimental therapies for children with cancer. And often I'm in a room with a family where current therapies have failed, that there are no options. And we discuss experimental treatments. And many families will turn to me and they'll say, what would you do for your child? I have 4 wonderful children. Unimaginable. So I tell them, I don't know. Because having a child with cancer is unimaginable. You can't imagine the fear that will strike a parent. Beyond normal imagination, you can't conceive of the fear of being told your child has cancer. and of facing the prospect of losing a child. So what I tell families is, I can't tell you what I would do, because even though I've been doing it for 25 years, I can't imagine sitting on the other side of this table. But what I can do is I can guide you. I can guide you through difficult times. And I'm going to be so bold as today as extend that. And what I'd like to do is help guide people who want to make things better, and to give some ideas on how we as a community can begin to solve this problem. So let me tell you about one of my patients who I saw just 2 weeks ago, Jordan. Jordan has the most common type of childhood cancer, childhood leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, ALL. Had Jordan been born in the 1960s, she would have had less than a 10% chance of survival. Having been born in the 1990s, her chance of survival approaches 90%. That's remarkable progress. Truly remarkable. But you need to dig a little bit deeper to understand both the challenges and the opportunities. If you look from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s, cure rates in childhood ALL went up, went up, went up. Almost straight line up. And you'd be right to assume it must have been a remarkable time in drug discovery and drug development to go from 10% to well over 80%. Well, we now use about 11 drugs to treat children with ALL. And here's what's really astounding. Half those drugs were discovered in the 1950s. 1950s. Most of the other half in the 1960s. One drug in the 1970s. All the drugs we needed, as far as anti-cancer drugs, were discovered more than 30 years ago. So how did we do it? Well, we did it through research, through understanding that childhood ALL was not a single disease, but it was many diseases. And we learned how to intensify our therapy, how to give more of it, and how to get children through that therapy. And with these very same drugs, we were able to push the cure rates. So what's the problem? Let me come back to Jordan, who is now a 16-year-old. Vibrant 16-year-old, doing the things you want a 16-year-old to do. And if you saw her in the room, you'd say, boy, there's a picture of life. What you wouldn't see is that Jordan had both her hips replaced. 16 years old. One of the effects of our therapy can be weakening of the bones. Bilateral hip replacement. And in fact, if you look at our survivors today, close to half of them will have a serious lifelong illness, let alone what children go through during therapy. If you ever visit a children's hospital or a pediatric cancer ward, most of the children who are in there because they're getting through a serious side effect. At some point in therapy, 4 out of 5 children will experience a severe, life-threatening, or fatal side effect. So the current situation, as impressive as our ability to cure cancer now is, the current situation is unacceptable. Nowhere in medicine would this be accepted. But we do this to our children because we have no choice. And we're here today to tell you we need to change it. And we are at the verge of understanding cancer in a way that we couldn't imagine. Now, another remarkable thing that took place in the 50s was that pediatric oncologists realized that childhood cancer is a rare disease. And unless they banded together, no one center, no one doctor was going to solve this problem. So So they said, we have to collaborate, we have to cooperate. And what emerged has led to what is today the Children's Oncology Group, the largest scientific medical collaboration in history. We have over 230 centers in North America, some other centers in other parts of the world, pediatric oncologists, nurses, pharmacists, scientists, who work together in studying childhood cancer. So a child, whether that child is in Wyoming, North Carolina, California, has the opportunity to participate in research that will improve the outcome. And now with efforts of discovery of what the real causes are of childhood cancer, we can leverage this enormous collaboration and really make a difference. But we can't do this alone. Dr. Evans pointed out rightly that the economic drivers for industry to develop new drugs are simply not there. Industry has a lot of expertise, they have a lot of talent that can be brought to bear on this problem. We just have to provide the right incentives. We have to level the playing field. And there are ways to do this. Bill referred to the Institute of Medicine report from 2005 that a number of us were a part of, and we made some proposals. But let me, in the last few minutes that I have, focus on what Congress can help us with. So fortunately, there were two pieces of legislation that changed the landscape of pediatric drug development. Not just pediatric cancer drug development, but pediatric drug development. The Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, BPCA, provides an incentive for companies that do the appropriate studies in children of drugs that might be beneficial for children. That will be up for renewal. That's had a major impact in a number of disease areas for children. It's had a modest impact for childhood cancer. Nonetheless, that incentive is critical to engaging industry in coming to the table to discuss what we can do. The Pediatric Research Equity Act. People refer to BPCA as the carrot and PREA as the stick. An extremely important piece of legislation that unfortunately for childhood cancer has had essentially no impact. That needs to be strengthened. The requirement for companies that are developing new cancer drugs, when it would be relevant to treat a childhood cancer, we need to strengthen that act. But without question, we know nothing works better than incentives. So the Creating Hope Act of 2010, introduced in the Senate by Senators Brownback, Brown, and Franken, is another approach to incentivizing industry to bring their expertise into this equation. And that needs to be given very serious consideration. We really are entering an unprecedented time in history where we're going to understand some of the fundamental drivers of childhood cancer. But unless we take that understanding and improve the outcome for children, we're going to have failed a generation of children. We need to invest in discovery. We need to make sure we're very high on the NIH's radar screen for discovery research. We need to incentivize industry to help us develop drugs. We need to assure that the most remarkable collaboration in the history of science, the Children's Oncology Group, is able to take those discoveries and bring them out to the children most in need of them, to study them, to determine what's going to happen. We're going to hear from a number of pediatric oncologists, and I can tell you, you will not find a more optimistic group of scientists or physicians in the world than pediatric oncologists. But we're not going to do that without your help. We need help on the legislative front. We need help on the philanthropic front. We need help on the advocacy front. But make no mistake, We can make this happen. And let today perhaps be, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, the tipping point. Let's make today the beginning of when we get the real momentum that we're going to need. And with the leadership of people like Congressman Sestak and Congressman McCaul and others in this room, I firmly believe that the next 5, 10 years will be a time that we can all be proud of, where we won't create stories like you've heard today, because we don't want any more unimaginable events occurring in our children's lives. So I thank you, and I thank you for your future efforts. And I'm going to now introduce Dr. Susan Blaney from Texas Children's Cancer Center.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Congressman McCaul and Congressman Sestak for giving me the opportunity to speak today at this Childhood Cancer Caucus. What I'm going to talk about today is barriers to drug development for cancer. But before I do that, I'd also like to thank all the members of the Pediatric Cancer Caucus, and a special thanks to all the advocates who tirelessly work at the local and national level to positively impact the outcomes for childhood cancer. As you've heard today, there have been tremendous strides in the cure and survival for the majority of children with cancer, but childhood cancer still remains the leading cause of death for children in the United States. We urgently need to develop new therapies, not only to improve the cure rates, but as Dr. Adamson said, to decrease the toxicity of the therapy for childhood cancer. We can't have these untoward side effects for our patients. Unfortunately, there are significant barriers to the development of new drugs for children with cancer. And it's really imperative that we reduce and eliminate the current barriers to develop effective, less toxic therapies, to minimize the impact of treatment side effects, and to increase the speed at which we're able to make meaningful progress. So in 2010, what are the barriers to drug development? I think we can really break these down into two general types of barriers. The first are practical barriers. They include barriers related to market economics and to drug access. The second are scientific barriers, such as the scientific challenge of identifying the molecular targets that cause a childhood cancer, a prerequisite of the development of new drugs to inactivate and eradicate the tumor, as Dr. Evans also alluded to. With regard to the practical realities of the marketplace, the development of new drugs to treat pediatric cancer is unprofitable. Childhood cancers comprise only 1% of cancer diagnoses in the U.S., less than 15,000 children a year. So all childhood cancers are orphan diseases, and industry that develops new drugs to cure childhood cancer, they're not going to do it because it's only profitable if the drug also has a role in the treatment of adult cancers or other diseases. Another practical barrier is that pharmaceutical companies are concerned sometimes that early access to anti-cancer drugs in children might impede or prevent the development of a drug being marketed in adults if something negative were to happen early in the phase of development in children. So as a result, timely access to promising new agents for study in preclinical model systems, the first step, even before we get to the clinic, or access to study in the clinic, can frequently be delayed. And sometimes that delay is for several years. And this is very frustrating as a researcher, and can't even imagine how frustrating it is for parents, for children. So as a practical consequence of these economic realities, is the development paradigm for anti-cancer drugs differs between children and adults. In contrast to new treatments for adult cancer, where the majority of drug development resources emanate from the pharmaceutical industry, substantial research and development resources from industry are rarely available for the development of new agents to treat childhood cancer. Therefore, the financial resources required for the performance of the preclinical and the clinical research for childhood cancer usually come from institutional, philanthropic, and or other federal dollars. The research resource differential between adult and childhood cancer drug development is further magnified since only a small fraction of federal dollars for cancer research, approximately 30%, are actually appropriated to research for childhood cancer. As a result, pediatric cancer investigators spend a substantial portion of their time developing proposals to obtain funding that is necessary to perform this research rather than actually being able to perform the novel research. Another obstacle in the development of childhood cancer drugs is that new oral anti-cancer medications are produced as formulations that are made for adults. That is, tablets or capsules. And children who are 7 or younger usually aren't able to swallow tablets or capsules. So what that means is that more research and development money has to go into developing pediatric formulations. But this research isn't initiated typically until relatively late in the drug development process. As such, access for young children to these drugs is further delayed, and these delays can be years, pending the availability of a formulation that young children can swallow. In addition to the practical barriers that I've outlined, there are also substantial scientific barriers that impede the development of new anti-cancer drugs, even in 2010. Cancer is a complex disease, and as we learn more about cancers at the molecular level, as you've heard today, what we used to think was one tumor type might be 2, 3, or even 4 different subtypes of the tumor. And that means that we don't need one approach to treat the tumor. We might need 4 different approaches for the same tumor. Fortunately, there are advances in technology that allow us to rapidly sequence all of the genes in the tumor, and we are now able to learn more about cancer biology than ever before. However, this is just the first step. We next need to understand and decode the data to unlock the key to figure out what has gone awry in the cell to make it cancerous. Once we do this, we must determine if we have available drugs that can target the abnormality in the pediatric cancer cell, or if we need to make new compounds to specifically target that target. And these types of scientific studies take teams of expert investigators and enormous financial resources. Resources that today aren't readily available for the support of pediatric cancer research. So just to summarize, despite the tremendous strides that you've heard about today in the treatment of childhood cancer, we still face substantial barriers in the timely access to studying promising new anti-cancer drugs for childhood cancer as a result of market realities. We also face barriers in the timely identification and development of treatments for childhood cancers that continue to evade cure. We have the tools and technology today to overcome the scientific barriers, but we need adequate resources. Incentives to engage industry earlier in pediatric drug development, legislation such as the bipartisan Creating Hope Act of 2010 are just some of the critical components to bolstering initiatives to provide both timely access and adequate funding so that we can safely and efficiently develop effective, less toxic, and curative treatments for childhood cancer. As you've heard, most of us cannot begin to imagine the fear and the devastation that a child and a family face when they're given a diagnosis of cancer. Time is of the essence. We need your help to overcoming these practical barriers to ensure that there are adequate resources and timely access to promising new agents for childhood cancer. This will enable physicians and scientists working together with the National Cancer Institute, the pharmaceutical industry, and our advocates to more rapidly cure childhood cancer and make care a reality for each child and every child who is diagnosed with cancer. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Jean Kleinerman from MD Anderson Cancer Center.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Peter. I think he so eloquently expressed what all of us feel in the pediatric oncology world, and he did it without notes, and I'm so impressed. I, however, am going to stick to my text because I want to stay on time as well, and I probably will get emotional. But I first want to express my gratitude to both Congressman McCaul and Congressman Sestak for organizing this first Childhood Cancer Summit and for recognizing the importance of pediatric cancer as a national health issue that is critically linked to childhood mortality rates in this country. My remarks this morning are going to be focused on pediatric cancer research priorities and the challenges from my perspective as a 30-year veteran in the field. Let me also thank Congresswoman Price, the other congressmen and women and their staff for attending this meeting so that they can learn more about what we consider a very important issue. So as you have heard from Dr. Adamson, we've reached a plateau in our ability to improve the cure rates in children with cancer using traditional chemotherapy. He's told you that most of these therapies were developed 30 and 40 years ago. Progress in pediatric cancer is therefore linked to basic research that can identify molecular abnormalities in order for us to develop newer therapies. These molecular abnormalities, as you heard from Dr. Evans, are not necessarily the same as those in adult tumors, and thus laboratory research must be focused on pediatric cancer. One of our goals today, and particularly my goal, is to raise awareness about inadequate funding for pediatric cancer research and to identify opportunities to enhance this support. An initiative that may be considered by the Congress is to establish a separate study section within the National Cancer Institute to review proposals that are focused on pediatric cancer. In my opinion, this would greatly facilitate and aid in increasing research in childhood cancer and ensure that proposals for pediatric cancer research are provided proper emphasis. This would help identify and fund the best proposals that focus on pediatric cancers. This new study section should include experts in the pediatric oncology field, investigators in the best position to judge the relevance to pediatric cancer. This effort will incentivize more investigators to focus on pediatric cancer, as it will provide a receptive panel of judges, which is extremely important. Another suggestion is to consider initiatives or funding opportunities, as Dr. Blaney alluded to accelerate the expansion of clinical trials focused on pediatric cancer. Inadequate funding and regulatory barriers limit progress towards identifying the most advanced diagnostics, treatments, and prevention tools for children with cancer. Any incentive in this area would accelerate clinical research, new agent development, and the translation of these discoveries into treatments at the bedside. These suggestions that I have talked about are based on my personal experience of over 26 years and the difficulties that I have encountered in new drug development for children with sarcoma that has spread to the lung. I have served on numerous study sections for the National Cancer Institute and the Department of Defense. I served on an advisory panel to the FDA. I am considered an international expert in childhood sarcoma research, and while I managed to maintain continuous funding from the National Cancer Institute for more than 24 years, I know firsthand the problems that occur when one is doing research in an orphan disease such as childhood sarcoma. I know the difficulties competing for research dollars against proposals that investigate the more common adult tumors. Rarely was my science questioned or my ability to perform the studies. There was never a question that my investigations would move the field of sarcoma forward. The criticisms always focused on the relative impact to the cancer problem. Serving on study sections, I witnessed outstanding applications focused on pediatric tumors ranked below what I considered inferior applications on adult cancers because the ones studying adult cancers were judged to be more important to the overall cancer problem. Childhood cancer is a rare disease. Sarcomas are also a rare disease. The number of patients that will be impacted is low compared to breast, lung, colon, and prostate cancer. Yet, in terms of life years saved, curing childhood cancer is equivalent to curing breast cancer because our patients go on to lead long, productive lives and become productive, tax-paying, voting citizens. We pediatric oncologists continue to struggle with yesterday's medicines. We need new ideas and new tools to fight the leading cause of death due to disease in children. This is a significant problem whose answer will only come from research. Establishing an independent childhood cancer study section within NCI and devising incentives for pediatric cancer drug development will help us achieve our goals. All of us on the multiple panels today look forward to working with Congress to expand pediatric cancer research opportunities that will ultimately impact the way we treat children in the future and will ultimately help us push the cure rates more towards 100%. Again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Now we'd like to ask a few questions. We're a little behind schedule, so I'll be brief, and then I'm sure Debbie will want to ask some questions as well. But first, Dr. Kleinerman, I was surprised, as you have talked about, that the people who issue the grants have really no background or expertise in pediatric oncology. And I think with the creation of the pediatric study section, hopefully we'll get that legislation to change that. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Oftentimes I would be in the study section. I would be the only pediatric oncologist on the study section. So it's not that the experts aren't scientifically terrific and demonstrated their expertise. It's that they don't have the perspective of childhood cancer, and they don't understand what is really important. Somebody who does research in lung cancer or breast cancer doesn't understand the nuances of neuroblastoma, one of the big solid childhood cancers that kills a lot of individuals. So that's why I think a study section comprised of pediatric oncologists who do research can judge what is the best science, where do we need it, what are the tumors that we need to focus on, and prioritize it in terms of pediatric oncology rather than prioritizing it in terms of the cancer problem.
And that seems so obvious, but hopefully we can correct that as well. My next question is both you and Dr. Blaney. Clinical trials. When I got a tour of Texas Children's Hospital, I was astounded that children's cell lines were being used for adult cures, and yet those treatments could not be used on children, even though they were created from child cell lines. Can you elaborate on that and also talk about access to clinical trials for children?
The primary issue is that there's marked delays in the access to evaluating the therapies. We're often able to evaluate them, but it might be 5 or 7 years after the drug is first entered trials in man. And that's just because of the the market reality is that if a drug is only successful in the treatment of pediatric cancer, that there's not a pharmaceutical, most pharmaceutical companies aren't interested in further development because it's not going to be profit generating.
Which leads me to my final question for you, Dr. Adamson. We do have the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act. We're looking at ways to incentivize the pharmaceutical companies to develop childhood cancer drugs. Obviously, there's a market failure, that the profit is not there. Can you elaborate more on how we can incentivize the private sector?
Well, certainly I think the exclusivity provision is a key one. The challenge becomes a company will take a hard look at, well, what is the real value? And it only applies to the specific drug. So if they have a drug that has a relatively small market value, there may not be much of an incentive to do the studies in children. On the other hand, they may have another drug that has much more significant market value. And so the potential to de-link it for a company might further the incentive. On the PREA side, I think the challenge there is today a drug is labeled for a specific disease. So a drug is labeled for lung cancer, or a drug is labeled for prostate cancer or breast cancer. The drug may be working on a pathway in a cancer cell that has relevance to childhood cancer. But the fact that it's labeled for a disease that occurs in adults means PREA doesn't kick in. It doesn't require a company to do studies. I think working with the agency as we begin to label drugs that target pathways, and if it's labeled to target a pathway, it should then apply to a different disease where that pathway is relevant for children.
Well, thank you for that, and I'll yield to my colleague, Deborah Price.
Well, thank you, Congressman McCaul and Congressman Sestak for bringing this issue to the forefront and holding this hearing and arranging it. It's no small matter to get this many people who are interested in one room at one time, and you've done a great job with it. Thank you so much. I don't know that I have any real questions for the panel, but you might have some response. I think as we look at our economy and watch resources drying up and really hard choices being made, we will continue to look for ways to help solve this problem without just throwing money at it. And I think we all need to be aware that because of the times, most particularly, there's going to be policy initiatives that we can pursue and changes in incentivizing drug companies. And I think if we all know that, I think we'll be better for it. I think the other thing is that did we include pharmaceuticals in the industry in this? I think maybe that's a good idea. Are there representatives here? And if there aren't, maybe we need to bring them into the picture more and have them a part of these discussions as we, they're critical, and they might as well be hearing what we're all hearing because it's important. They're a key partner. The other thing I just want to acknowledge the great efforts of Nancy Goodman, who I thought was presenting today, but she pressed the President Obama has declared that September is Pediatric Cancer Awareness Month. Is that the right designation? And so thank you, Nancy, for that. But every effort like that just advances our cause one more step. And so, wherever you can apply yourself to make a difference, continue to do it. Thank you very, very much, all of you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel.
Dr. Melissa Hudson and Dr. Kevin Effinger. Dr. Hudson is a pediatric hematology oncologist and director of the Cancer Survivorship Program at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. She's done extensive research on many survivorship issues, including the late effects of cancer therapy, the impact of tobacco smoke exposure to survivors, and the psychosocial and learning impairments unique to this population. Please welcome Dr. Hudson. Dr. Effinger is a primary care physician and director of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center Adult Long-Term Follow-Up Program, is that a mouthful, in New York City. The program provides follow-up care for adults who have cancer during their childhood, adolescent, or adult years. He serves on the steering committee for the NCI-sponsored Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, which follows more than 14,000 long-term survivors of pediatric care. He has also written extensively on the subject. Please welcome Dr. Effinger.
Congresswoman Spear and Congressman McCaul and Sestak and Congresswoman Price and the Pediatric Cancer Caucus, we really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk with you. And I applaud the colleagues that spoke before us in really showing the way of increasing these cure rates by very substantial measures, especially when we compare that to the success rates that we've seen with our adult cancer. So they're to be applauded. And what Congresswoman Spear has alluded to is the story's not over at the end of the cure. There's much more that goes on after that. And not only do we need to maximize cure rates, but we also need to minimize the cost, not the financial cost, but the physical cost, the psychosocial cost of cancer therapy. My good friend and colleague, Dr. Melissa Hudson, and I are used to showing these things on PowerPoint, so we're going to do a little bit of a back and forth show here and run through slides, because much of what we show is better illustrated by a picture, black and white, rather than simply reading out a statement on that. So let me start with our first slide. As was already mentioned, the success rate is 80% of children that are diagnosed with cancer today will survive 5 years or more. 80%, 4 out of 5. Still, 1 out of 5 does not make it to the 5-year mark, but 4 out of 5 do. That translates to roughly 328,000 pediatric cancer survivors in our country. For perspective, there are 12 million survivors of adult cancer. So back to that number game that Dr. McCaul was talking about, 328,000 versus 12 million. Roughly 1 out of every 570 young adults in our country is a pediatric cancer survivor. So because of the rare nature of this condition and because of the need to consolidate and cooperate in research, the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study was started back in 1994, led by Dr. Les Robison, who's at St. Jude. It's supported by the National Institutes of Health with the National Cancer Institute. There were originally 26 participating institutions, now there's 30. We're following a little over 14,000 survivors who were diagnosed 1970 to 1986. So these patients are all now in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, some almost entering into their 60s. And to compare outcomes, we have about 3,600 of their brothers and sisters, their siblings. And to look at more contemporary therapy, we're in the process of expanding that cohort to include patients diagnosed 1987 to 1999. This is probably the most stark slide that I'm going to show. So let me set it up for you. This is data from the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study. What you see up along the survival function is, you can think of that in percentages, 100%, 96%, 92%, etc. These are survival. So these are all patients that entered into the study. They had to have survived at least 5 years. So we're starting at 100% survival. They already survived 5 years. And the two top lines are what we would have estimated based upon data from the general population for the same age, what they should have had. But instead what you see is that there is a continued loss, a continued premature mortality for this population. Early on, that's because of second cancers, because of the recurrence of their primary cancer, but later on, that's second cancers, heart attacks, pulmonary disease, things of that nature. Very, very importantly, those curves could be flattened or significantly closer to the general population with good follow-up care with technology that we already have. with guidelines that we already use if our patients are having access to high-quality cancer follow-up. The next slide. Not only is premature mortality a problem, but having chronic health conditions. As Congresswoman Spear mentioned, there's a significant morbidity, a significant price that many of these patients pay. This is a little bit updated data from what she had presented, where we looked at a little over 10,000 patients within the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study. We looked at them 30 years out from having their diagnosis. So for perspective, that's a 5-year-old going out to age 35. And what you see is that 73% of the patients had at least one chronic health condition. I see a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds in here. Think of that. At least 7 out of 10 having at least one chronic health condition. 42% had a serious, life-threatening, or disabling condition, or actually died of a late effect related to the radiation, or chemotherapy, or the surgery. Almost 1 out of 2 having a serious complication, and many of these patients having 3, 4, 5, 6 different problems. Multiple cancers caused by their curative therapy, the radiation or the chemotherapy. Next slide, please. I mentioned second cancers. This is our most recent data showing what we call the cumulative incidence. So if you look at a certain percentage at a time, it shows you how many of the patients, how many of the survivors within the cohort have had a second malignant neoplasm. It's approaching 10% out of the entire cohort. Some groups are at a very high risk. Our Hodgkin lymphoma patients, that exceeds that number significantly. For example, a woman treated with mantle radiation or chest field radiation for Hodgkin lymphoma in the 1970s or 80s with moderate dose has a 1 in 5 chance, of being diagnosed with breast cancer by age 45. For contrast, in the general population, it's 1 in 100. So we see a lot of breast cancer, again, can be early detected, treated, and taken care of, and not going to the mortality rates that I showed in the previous slide. We see a tremendous number of non-melanoma skin cancer. That's the second line that you see in that slide, or basal cell cancers. For those of you old enough to remember President Reagan having his basal cell cancers removed during his presidency. They're not killing cancers. They're not cancers that are going to cause major problems, but they're definitely a marker of what happens with our therapies as these patients age, and it's within the radiation field. So our patients that have spinal radiation will see multiple basal cell cancers along their back. In a study led by my colleague, Dr. Hudson, we looked at adverse health status among our cohort. You can think of health status as the intersection between quality of life and chronic disease. We looked at a little over 9,500 of our young adult survivors in the cohort, and we're reporting moderate to extreme. So these are not mild changes, but moderate to extreme adverse, or you can think of it as poor outcomes. So for general health, 10% of the population of the cohort, mental health, 17%, functionally impaired, again, to a moderate to extreme degree, 11%, and so on. And you see for any one of those 6 domains, it's about 10 to 17% of the cohort is affected by that. But if we look instead at the likelihood of survivor having at least one of those significantly affected areas, it's 43%, or almost 1 out of every 2. So not only are they dying at a young age, not only are they having chronic health conditions, but their lives are being impaired and impacted to a great extent. Around this time, people will raise their hand and say, Kevin, that's data that we know from the patients treated in the 1970s and 80s. Aren't we doing a better job now? So let me give you an example. This is a mother-daughter pair, Lorraine the mom, Lauren the daughter. Mother Lorraine was diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma back in 1975, right in the middle of the time period of the data that I'm presenting. She was treated with mantle or chest field radiation, and then an unknown dose, her records have since been destroyed, of abdominal radiation. She's been diagnosed with thyroid cancer at the age of 51, breast cancer at the age of 55, 2 artery bypass grafts. She actually had a 90% left main lesion that would have led to sudden death if not detected at an early stage. She's had multiple basal cell cancers. She lives without a spleen, so she has a lifetime 2 to 4% risk of an overwhelming infection. She has diabetes, a fatty liver, lipid abnormalities, restricted lung disease, and musculoskeletal problems, all related to her previous cancer therapy. Unfortunately, her daughter was also diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma. She was diagnosed in 2002 at the age of 14 and a half, treated with our contemporary modern era therapy, lower doses of radiation, lower fields, lower volumes of radiation, chemotherapy with lower doses, more spread out in the ATOP protocol, but unfortunately suffered one of the consequences that we will see with that protocol, and she developed a secondary leukemia directly related to her chemotherapy treatment for her Hodgkin lymphoma. So she underwent a bone marrow transplant and preconditioning with very high dose chemotherapy, and she has ovarian failure. She'll never have her own biological children. She has osteonecrosis, or a vascular necrosis of her hips. She has not yet had her hip replaced, but in the next 5 to 10 years, she'll have bilateral hip replacements. She has thyroid problems, prediabetes, will be diabetic in the near future, lipid abnormalities, and then has iron overload from her multiple transfusions, leading to need for phlebotomies on a regular basis. While we hope that our contemporary therapy won't be like this in all cases, we know that to be able to effectively cure the cancer takes much toxic therapy. The key is that we understand what we can do with this population to actually lower the risk or determine and detect their problems at an early stage. As Dr. Hudson is going to talk in the next several slides, the key is getting these patients back into good, high-quality follow-up care. So with that, I'm going to trade places with her and turn it over to her.
So Dr. Eppinger has educated you that chronic health conditions are very commonly reported by adults who've been treated for cancer during childhood. And as illustrated in this data that represents information published by the Child Cancer Survivor Study, we see that on the prevalence, the cumulative proportion of long-term survivors who were treated for childhood cancer, as the time increases from their diagnosis and therapy, there's an increasing prevalence of these chronic health conditions. Concurrently, there is a decline, as noted in the blue curve, in the proportion of survivors who are reporting medical follow-up at a cancer center staffed by clinicians with expertise in these late health complications or late effects of childhood cancer. And we recommend lifelong follow-up for all of our childhood cancer survivors, and particularly recommend a risk-based care approach. And this should include a systematic plan for lifelong screening, surveillance, and prevention that considers risks associated with the cancer experience, the cancer itself, the cancer treatment, genetic factors, the specific treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, transfusion, transplants. In addition, the other factors that are contributed by comorbid health conditions and lifestyle factors. All of these will in fact relate to the ultimate risk of late effects that is expressed in an individual cancer survivor. Research by the Child Cancer Survivor Study indicate that while greater than 90% of adults surviving cancer report contact within the previous 2 years with the medical provider, we actually see a relatively low proportion, less than 20%, of survivors who are reporting having this risk-based or survivor-focused care that considers the potential health risks predisposed by treatment for childhood cancer. And we know that there's challenges with providing care for our long-term survivors. Our survivors lack knowledge about their cancer treatment in many cases and the specific health risks predisposed by that therapy. They have limited access to these long-term follow-up programs run by specialists with survivorship expertise. They often and more likely would receive care from community providers who are unfamiliar with their survivorship health risks and uncomfortable often in supervising the care of survivors who have very complex health issues. Providers, survivors, and families about risk-based care. These resources may be late effects publications, cancer center long-term follow-up programs, pediatric cooperative group trials, and the resources offered by the Children's Oncology Group. Survivor advocacy and nonprofit groups provide tremendous resources for the specific needs of many of our survivors. And then late effects screening guidelines or specific health recommendations about aspects of health that can be impacted by the cancer experience and what kind of screening and preventative care that can be undertaken to maintain health in our survivors. The COG guidelines, long-term follow-up guidelines for survivors of childhood, adolescent, and young adult cancers represent an important resource that is supported by the Children's Oncology Group
And this resource was organized to increase awareness about the potential late effects and to standardize and enhance follow-up care for our survivors of pediatric cancer throughout their lifespan. Optimizing survivor health care also involves research, and we desperately need research to evaluate the health outcomes of new and evolving cancer treatment protocols. We need research to identify predictors of adverse health outcomes after specific treatments. We need research to understand better the health of our aging survivors and what aging contributes to their health outcomes. We need research to guide the recommendations to be made within our health surveillance and health screening regimens like the Children's Oncology Group guidelines. And we need research to inform and evaluate interventions to preserve health and quality of survival in our cancer patients. Now, increasing awareness among legislators and the public is an important aspect of facilitating funding for survivor-focused research. And this slide illustrates that in 2003, at the time that the Institute of Medicine reports on improving quality of care was released to the public, we had only 7 NIH-funded programs focusing on survivor care, pediatric cancer survivor care. Now, in fiscal year 2010, there were 42, but that needs to be contrasted with the fact that there were over 700 other NIH grants that were in 2010 that focused on general pediatric cancer. So you can see that long-term survivor-focused research represents a very, very small proportion of the studies that are funded. And considering that this population is growing and continues to increase over time due to therapeutic successes, it's important that we do allocate funds on these health issues of very long-term survivors. We believe that HR 2109 is an essential step in improving the health outcomes and quality of life of childhood cancer survivors, as it aims to improve outcomes and reduce disparities within minority and underserved populations. It hopes to establish culturally competent training programs for healthcare professionals intent on improving quality of care delivered to childhood cancer survivors, and to enhance long-term care of survivors, including evaluation of existing systems of follow-up care, establishment of pilot programs to develop, study, or evaluate model systems, and this also will include comprehensive cancer center-based programs for monitoring and caring for childhood cancer survivors. If accomplished, this long-term goal will improve physical and psychosocial care for childhood cancer survivors. So, in summary, we feel like the National Cancer Institute has made a significant investment in establishing and expanding the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study. And while the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study has substantially advanced in our understanding of long-term outcomes among childhood cancer survivors, it remains the single most important investment, and we need others of the same nature to advance childhood cancer survivor research. We hope that the future directions of this research will help us better understand why late effects develop and help us further refine who is at highest or lowest risk and help us develop and test risk-reducing interventions. Our challenge then will be expanding the number of high-quality funded studies to answer these questions. And I'd like to close by adding my thanks to Congressman McCaul and Sestak for organizing the Pediatric Cancer Caucus and permitting us to highlight our concerns and the resources needed to improve outcomes and long-term quality of life for our childhood cancer patients. Thank you so much.
Let me thank the panel and also recognize the arrival of my co-chair, Congressman Joe Sestak. Thank you so much. Joe's going to introduce the third panel and after a few questions, and then he'll make some remarks at that time. Very, very quickly, can you distinguish between adult versus pediatric survivorship issues? I think, obviously, when you have a child who is cured, the longevity or lifespan is much longer, and so therefore, I think there are greater issues there. And then secondly, when I went to Texas Children's Hospital, I was introduced to a program called Passport for Cure. And it's basically an online database for pediatric cancer patients to manage their condition for the rest of their lives using electronic in modern day electronic devices. Can you expand on that and how the Congress could help in that area as well?
I'll address the first part of the question, and then Dr. Hudson the second. With respect to comparing outcomes of pediatric cancer survivors to that of adult with respect to late effects of therapy, there's two vulnerable times in our lives, those in our early years and then those in our later years. And that's when our organ systems are so sensitive to the chemotherapy or radiation. Interestingly enough, you can use the same dose of radiation, the same volume of radiation for a patient that's 5 years old, 50 years old, 25-year-old, or 45-year-old and have very different outcomes with respect to heart disease or breast cancer in the ensuing years. So the key part is looking at these very vulnerable and underrepresented populations on there. And as was emphasized at the start, these are also patients that have a longevity. I take care of a number of patients that are in their 50s and 60s that have already had 4 primary cancers, heart disease, etc., but they're contributing members of our society. They live very fulfilled, very full lives on there. The key is getting them the right care at the right time.
I'm going to comment about Passport for Care, which is a very exciting initiative that is ongoing and tested by researchers at Baylor College of Medicine in collaboration with researchers from the Children's Oncology Group Guidelines. And the goal of this type of system is to have that individual patient have access to their health history. And what is unique about the Passport is that we are, in our collaboration with the COG Guideline Initiative, we are incorporating the health screening recommendations pertinent to that individual survivor so they can have a personalized output that would tell them and the doctors or clinicians that they choose to share their Passport with about their unique health risks, the specific health screening recommendations to monitor their health, as well as other resources that are available to them should they have some of the health outcomes that are targeted there.
Well, thank you very much. And at this time, I'll yield to my co-chair. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me yield to the author of the survivorship bill.
Thank you. Dr. Effinger, the slide you put out that showed Lorraine and Lauren and the various conditions that they're struggling with now was so disheartening to me because it suggests that even for the amount of money we put in for additional studies, that they're still suffering with extraordinary cancers and health conditions. Make me more optimistic, please.
We'll both make a comment on that. We, in our expanded cohort of the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, will be able to quantify that better rather than using an anecdotal experience. However, my clinic is filled with patients just like Lauren. We take care of a higher risk population that do suffer consequences. I do think that it will be lower than what we saw from the 1970s and 80s, not as low as what we would like to be, but the emphasis is that many of these problems can be minimized with early diagnosis. So for example, if I talk about somebody having breast cancer or thyroid cancer or even heart disease, when we detect it at an early phase, or even in heart disease, if we prevent it, knowing that the radiation may later lead to it, are very aggressive with their management of their lipids, their blood pressure, their weight, their activity levels, we can change those curves substantially. In the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, 26% of women that have been diagnosed with breast cancer have died. 26% of women with breast cancer have died. I have never yet taken care of a woman with breast cancer after chest radiation that has died, because we can detect these with our modern technology when they're 1 or 2 millimeters, non-invasive or early invasive, very treatable with the surgery, which is a big deal, but without the further consequences that we talk about later.
I've got to make a comment as a pediatric oncologist. Now remember, Dr. Effinger is running a long-term follow-up program that is seeing adult survivors, and they're very high risk for the most part. I run a long-term follow-up program that sees a spectrum of survivors treated now with contemporary therapy. And the survivors that enter our program, you wouldn't know they had any health issues, and actually many do not have health issues. Current therapy is risk adapted. You know, if you come in with a very low risk, biologically favorable malignancy, your treatment is very limited. you may not have radiation, you may not have these chemotherapy exposures or a transplant that would lead to this long-term morbidity. So in fact, the majority of our survivors that we see, we're telling them, you've had some limited exposures, but we're concerned for your health. We want you to be proactive about your health. And we're having difficulty engaging them because they are perfectly well. You'll see more of a spectrum of life-altering toxicities with contemporary therapy, meaning you may have to take medication for a thyroid problem, or our infertility represents a very life-altering but not life-threatening condition. So we are just as focused on improving outcomes for those kids who have these very limited therapies, and you'll see the vast majority of pediatric patients, oncology patients, it is a very limited risk-adapted therapy unless they are high risk and have very aggressive malignancies. So don't be disheartened. It's much, much better than that.
Joe,
On one of your graphs, did I catch it right that the mental challenges was one of the highest incidents of the impacts as you went forward? I think the highest at 17%. Is that wrong? Or did I read that?
It is. It's the most common of the health status domains that we evaluated that are impacted by the cancer experience. I like to think about that in the perspective of, the alternative of that. There's actually a minority of survivors that we see, and we can actually anticipate who will be in those high-risk groups based on their treatment exposures, socioeconomic issues, their access to resources in their community. So we think it's important to highlight who is at risk and understand those characteristics because we can give them the resources to improve their outcomes long-term.
Just add to that. These were patients having depressive or anxious symptoms that were on a regular basis, but amazingly very resilient. And so what we see in pediatric cancer survivors is this dual continuum of both post-traumatic stress or anxious or depressive symptoms, concurrent with a real sense of victory, resilience. These patients have incredibly full lives on there, even though we show some of the data that we've presented.
Let me thank the panel and Joe, your turn.
Good morning. Mike Penn. Your leadership is wonderful. I met Debbie Price when I came down here to Congress, and I was partaking with her. And she brought me into this effort. But Mike, it's great flying on the wing. Jackie, thank you for being here today. I'm going to introduce the third panel. And the subject is the impact of childhood cancer, but particularly on families. I know. I was living the life of Riley. I was a sailor, 30-some years. Got married, finally came home from sea at the age of 46 and got married. And then a few years later, had as every child, every parent has it, the perfect child. The only perfect child in the world. And at the age of 4, as we walked out of the first brain operation, I had asked, and being an admiral in the Navy, it was the one time I really took advantage of my rank and asked if the pathologist could be in the surgery room at Walter Reed. And for those that know, used to the pathology there at Walter Reed is the gold standard around the nation. And as she was wheeled out, the pathologist took me aside, and as we discussed it, he said, 3 to 9 months. Maybe your whole world changes. And I can remember just going outside, outside looking up, wow. But it does have a significant impact. I'm here today, solely. Never want to have anything to do with this place. But I'm here today because of that experience. This is payback to it. For me. And that's what I'm grateful for you today. I mean, this had an impact. I came out, I was 4 years old. And, it was one morning, she woke up, and for whatever reason, almost all her hair fell out one day. And she woke up, it's all there. And she and she goes like this, I didn't want to see a mirror, you know. So I gave it to her. At 4 years old, all girl, she says, I'll never be beautiful again. And you're here. You know, it just changes. Although some of my most fond memories are of at that age. When she done her chemotherapy, taken her down to Alexandria place, and we just dance in her Cinderella bald head, and she just danced at lunchtime, and so my point is, it really does have a significant impact on families. And today we have two wonderful people that have taken such an extra step and are out there to help others. Because the doctor told us, get her down 5 years, and don't worry, we'll have something else being developed that'll take you down the next 5. And just like the previous panel, we all worry about now is whether the hormone system be one that should go natural, and you worry about these things. And so all these efforts, and how this everybody's come together for this, I'm very grateful for personally. I'm going to introduce two wonderful people, and the first is Nancy Goodman, and the second is Dr. Susan Lena, both who have lost their children. But both have gone on because of the impact, as Nancy has done, to become the founder and the executive director of Kids for Cancer, Kids versus Cancer. It makes a great statement. And she's done a lot of innovative efforts over there in the Senate with the legislation of how can we get pharmaceutical companies to begin to think with the right incentives to help us out in some of these niche areas that affect so many of us. And Susan, who is probably one of the leading, probably one of the more pivotal efforts that we can have in childhood cancer policy and its advancement throughout. So if Susan and Nancy are here, I'm just very, very grateful and thankful for giving them part of the
I would like to thank Congressman Michael McCaul, Congressman Joe Sestak, and the entire Pediatric Cancer Caucus for allowing me to speak today on behalf of children diagnosed with cancer. I am the founder and executive director of Kids vs. Cancer, but I speak to you first and foremost as a parent who's lost a child to cancer. My son Jacob was your typical wonderful 8-year-old boy when he was first diagnosed. Sweet kid, good brother, an able student, an enthusiastic athlete, and a passionate rock and roll vocalist and keyboard player. After some unexplained morning headaches and nausea, we were told that Jacob had medulloblastoma, a form of rare pediatric brain cancer. Jacob endured several surgeries, 6 weeks of daily radiation, and many difficult chemotherapies. He suffered severe neurological and cognitive impairments, including an inability to speak for a time, an inability to move. He was wheelchair-bound, he lost gross and fine motor skills, he experienced significant memory deficits. Jacob had unmanaged pain, anorexia, nausea, baldness, and multiple infections. He was hospitalized for months at a time. And still, unbelievably, he never complained. He just focused on his friends and his family and going to school as much as possible. Jacob died a year and a half ago at age 10. When a child dies of cancer, that child loses almost 70 years of life on average. For Jacob, that meant he missed his first date, graduating from high school, going to college, finding a first job, getting married, or having children. During our hard-fought efforts to save our son, we came to realize that Jacob and children with pediatric cancer are at a serious disadvantage when it comes to research for treatments and a cure.
At the heart of our efforts are the very sobering statistics on the allocation of resources to combat pediatric cancer. And I'd like to just share a couple with you. The FDA has had an initial approval of only one pediatric cancer drug in the past 20 years. The National Cancer Institute spends less than 4% of its budget on all basic translational and clinical research for all pediatric cancers. And the incidence of invasive pediatric cancers has increased by 29% over the past 20 years. If you look at these statistics, you can see there's clearly a crisis in the system that your caucus should be commended for highlighting today. Our goal is simple: to bring pediatric cancer researchers the resources they need to find better treatments for childhood cancers. Our efforts are focused in 3 areas: access to new drugs, tumor tissue, and funding. Within weeks of Jacob's diagnosis, it became clear that his tumors were unresponsive to standard combination of radiation and chemotherapy in medulloblastoma. Yet the protocol our medical team was planning to give, Jacob was unlikely to work, they proceeded nonetheless because there were no other reasonable alternatives. Over the past 30 years, treatment for medulloblastoma has not materially changed. Federal funding for new drugs for medulloblastoma is near zero, and no pharmaceutical company can afford to engage in research and development for new drugs for children like Jacob without significant government assistance because the market is too small. What drug innovations there are for childhood cancers come from hand-me-down adult drugs that may coincidentally have efficacy for children too. This is a poor strategy. Childhood cancers tend to have different root causes than adult cancers and require unique drugs. Yet, as I said, in the past 20 years, the FDA has had initial approval of only one new drug, clofazimine, for any pediatric cancer. We need to create market incentives for biotech and pharmaceutical companies to invest in the development of pediatric cancers. And in that regard, Kids vs. Cancer has worked closely with and applauds the efforts of Senators Sam Brownback and Sherrod Brown, a Republican from Kansas and a Democrat from Ohio, who introduced the Creating Hope Act in 2010, a bill that would provide incentives for biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs for pediatric cancers and other pediatric rare diseases through a priority review voucher program. The way this program works is that if a company develops a drug for a pediatric cancer or other pediatric rare disease and receives FDA approval, it receives not only that approval, but a voucher. The voucher can be held or sold, and the voucher comes with rights to expedited FDA approval for any other drug, perhaps a blockbuster drug for, say, hair loss, and exercise of that voucher gets the drug, the approved blockbuster drug, to market many months earlier, enabling that drug to capture that many more months of significant profits. The estimated value of the vouchers could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and there is no taxpayer burden to this program. Kids vs. Cancer hopes that the Pediatric Cancer Caucus and the entire pediatric cancer community will join us in advocating for the passage of this important legislation. In addition to access to new drugs, pediatric cancer researchers also need access to tissue to better understand the biologies and test potential treatments for childhood cancers. When Jacob died, we arranged for his tissue to be sent to 4 different researchers whom we had consulted during Jacob's treatment. One performed the first genetic analysis of primary versus metastatic tissue on medulloblastoma and determined, importantly, that metastases are fundamentally different than the primary tumor. Another researcher, who works for Dr. Blaney, harvested viable tumor cells from Jacob's postmortem tumor tissues, and by injecting these tumor cells in the brains of immunodeficient mice, he built the first ever xenographed postmortem brain tumor tissue model for any diagnosis of brain cancer, pediatric or adult. That we had 2 major breakthroughs out of 4 researchers underscores how much good science is waiting to be done if researchers can only get their hands on the necessary materials. Toward this end, Kids vs. Cancer is launching a parent-led pediatric postmortem brain tumor tissue donation program. Through our website, we will provide outreach and support to parents for children with terminal brain cancer, letting them know that tissue donation is an option. For physicians, we will be offering counseling on how to approach parents about tissue donation, as well as logistical support about how to execute upon a request. We will also provide information about researchers seeking postmortem tissue and their projects. The National Cancer Institute spends over $4.8 billion in healthcare, but spends only $190 million, under 4% of its budget, on all basic translational and clinical research for all pediatric cancers. As almost the sole provider of funding to pediatric cancer research, NCI funding levels are particularly important because unlike adult cancers where the size of the potential market, because of the size of the potential market, 60% of the research funding comes from private industry, private funding for pediatric cancer research is negligible. We as a community must consider numerous issues to understand how to achieve the most appropriate quality and quantity of federal funding of pediatric cancer research, including by removing any structural impairments to optimal allocation of resources. For example, does the NCI and NIH peer review process undervalue important and unique aspects of childhood cancer, such as years of lives lost with the death of each child, poor quality of life for childhood cancer survivors, and the value our society places on protecting children? Do peer review scoring guidelines that narrowly define public health disfavor important knowledge that can be gained from childhood cancer research? Do they instead focus on next step innovations in the best studied cancers affecting adult patients? Does the NCI process for establishing directed grants adequately address the opportunities and needs of the pediatric research community? Should pediatric cancer research be a higher priority for other government funding sources? In the coming months, Kids vs. Cancer will be exploring these and other funding questions. We are in a period of unprecedented medical breakthroughs. Our hope is that children with cancer will fully benefit from this exciting scientific time. Kids vs. Cancer will work to continue promoting the passage of the Creating Hope Act of 2010 to encourage new development. We will work to expand the availability of tissue for cutting-edge research, and we will increase funding to ensure that every worthy idea in pediatric cancer research is fully explored. We appreciate the interest, commitment, and support of the Pediatric Cancer Caucus and look forward to working with you towards these objectives so that one day, children like Jacob will be able to live out full, healthy, and productive lives.